April 18, 1943, 24,000 feet above Rabaul, New Britain. The sun was still climbing when the glint of aluminum pierced the blue silence above the Pacific. Lieutenant Jiro Hirose of the Imperial Japanese Navy squinted through his Type 98 reflector sight, sweat beading beneath his leather helmet. Below him, the emerald jungles of New Britain unfurled like a tapestry, stitched with winding rivers and smoke from distant anti-aircraft batteries. But his eyes weren't on the ground. They were locked on the new American fighters climbing toward them. They were ugly. Thick midsections, oversized cowlings, squared-off wingtips. The enemy machines looked nothing like the graceful Mitsubishi A6M Zeros of the 251st Kokutai. To Hirose and his wingmen, these newcomers were clumsy, bloated iron birds, lumbering, flying buses, unworthy of serious concern. "Bakayaro," Hirose muttered under his breath. "Idiots." He clicked his mic. "Stay in formation. Let them come. They'll fall like the others." The formation of 6 Hellcats was fresh off the carrier USS Essex, flying combat sorties for the first time over the Solomon Islands. Among them was Lieutenant, junior grade, Alex Harper, gripping the stick of his F6F like his life depended on it. Because it did. The air in the cockpit buzzed with static and adrenaline. His altimeter ticked up, engine roaring, props spinning at 2,550 RPM. He could feel the torque in his bones. He was the tip of the spear now. His squadron commander's voice cut through the tension. "Contact, high left, Zeros inbound. Stay tight. Don't climb into their turn. Force the vertical." Harper spotted them. 6 Zeros, banking in tandem like birds of prey. Their noses dipped into a dive, sunlight flashing off their wings. In seconds, they'd be within range. His heart pounded. This was it. The debut of the F6F Hellcat in true combat. No simulations, no mock dogfights. Just bullets, steel, and gravity. And the Japanese weren't worried. Not yet, the fatal miscalculation. For over 2 years, the Zero had dominated the skies. Its lightweight frame, tight turning radius, and agility had devastated everything from P-40s to Wildcats. Japanese aces had grown confident. Some would say arrogant. By mid-1943, many believed that no American fighter could match their design in maneuverability. So when rumors trickled in of a new American carrier fighter, the first sightings drew laughter. Reports from Truk and Saipan described it as large, underpowered, and too heavy to dogfight. The Zero pilots dubbed it another fat Wildcat. The nickname stuck. Hayabusa Bus, the Falcon Bus. But they didn't know what it could do, not yet. The F6F Hellcat had been forged in the crucible of failure. Lessons from Guadalcanal and Midway had shaped every line of its design. It was 56 inches longer than the Wildcat, with a wide-track landing gear, thicker armor plating, and a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. It could take punishment that would shred a Zero, and it could climb. Oh, it could climb. The first clash, Jiro Hirose was the first to engage. He rolled left and dove, his Zero screaming past 300 knots. He picked the lead Hellcat and opened fire, 20mm cannons blazing. The tracers stitched toward the blue fuselage. But then something happened. The Hellcat didn't bank. It didn't panic. It pitched up, violently. The bulky American fighter arced into a sharp vertical climb, slipping above Hirose's attack path like a ghost. Harper snapped his stick back, kicking in full throttle. The R2800 roared to life, and gravity surrendered. He was inverted now, above the Zero, pulling hard. Hirose overshot. Too fast, too late. Harper rolled over the top and dove. Now he had the altitude. Now he was the Predator. 50 caliber machine guns opened fire. 6 of them. The thunder shook his canopy. Tracers ripped through the air, slamming into the Zero's wing root. Black smoke erupted from Hiros's engine. The aircraft jerked violently, flames licking the cowling. It went down in seconds. Shock in the cockpit. A stunned silence rippled through the Japanese formation. The Hellcats didn't dogfight like the old Wildcats. They didn't fall for the turn. They fought vertically, climbing, diving, slashing. Their thick armor soaked up fire. Their engines outran the Zero on the way up and on the way down. Petty Officer Fujita tried to shake a pursuing Hellcat by spiraling down. The American followed and pulled tighter. The chase ended in a burst of flame and twisted aluminum. One by one, the Zeros fell. Of the 6 Japanese fighters, only 2 returned to base. Harper landed back on the Essex, with kill markings he hadn't expected on his first sortie. His hands trembled as he removed his helmet, the air reeking of sweat and cordite. The Hellcat had spoken, and the Japanese were no longer laughing. June 1942. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, Bethpage, New York. The war was shifting, and not in America's favor. News of the early Pacific battles had rocked the Navy. The Mitsubishi Zero had outflown, outclimbed, and outgunned every American fighter it faced. The F6F Wildcat, valiant as it was, had reached its ceiling. What the Navy needed now was something different, something brutal, something invincible. Inside the design offices of Grumman, a quiet revolution was taking place. The man at the center of it was Roy Grumman himself. Tall, bespectacled, and rarely without a slide rule, Grumman wasn't just building another aircraft. He was building a Predator. He and his team had pored over pilot reports from the Solomons. They listened to the warnings. They read the after-action notes from men who barely survived the Zero's bite. And then they designed a killer. They called it the F6F-1. A prototype with a large wingspan, reinforced armor, and space for 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns. But even that wasn't enough. During test flights, the aircraft felt underpowered. Naval test pilot Butch Voris put it bluntly, "It's got guts, but it needs muscle." Grumman responded decisively. He tore out the Wright R2600 engine and replaced it with the most powerful American radial available, the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. The result was the F6F3. It was no longer a concept, it was a monster. From workshop to war machine. By mid-1943, production was ramping up. The assembly lines at Grumman's Iron Works were a marvel of wartime industry. Hundreds of workers fitting together Hellcats in under 60 hours apiece. Simplicity in maintenance was paramount. Pilots had no time for delicate machinery. If a plane came back with damage, the crews needed to patch it, reload it, and send it back out the next morning. The F6F was made for that. One mechanic later said, "Hellcats came back with bullet holes, shrapnel, sometimes a foot of the wing missing. They'd still land. You'd weld it, rivet it, and she'd fly again." Even before its combat debut, Navy aviators began to whisper about the new fighter. Can it outturn a Zero? No. Can it outclimb one? Every day of the week. The first test, Tarawa, November 1943. After its brief and bloody debut over Rabaul, the Hellcat's real proving ground came during the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign. Operation Galvanic was underway, and the Japanese held airfields across Tarawa Atoll and Makin Island. From the decks of USS Essex, USS Enterprise, and USS Yorktown, squadrons of F6Fs were launched by the dozens. Lieutenant Commander Hamilton McWhorter, one of the Navy's earliest Hellcat aces, led his squadron into the fray. Their target, Tarawa's Betio airfield, where dozens of Zeros waited. McWhorter didn't flinch. We knew what we were flying, and we knew the enemy. The sky over Betio turned into a killing field. Hellcats dove into the fight in disciplined sections, 2 by 2. They refused to dogfight. Instead, they slashed through Japanese formations, using superior speed and firepower, then zoomed back up into the clouds. Their .650 calibers chewed through Zeros like butter. Aviation machinists, mate second class, Paul Wells recalled. The sky looked like a beehive, but our Hellcats were steel bees, and they stung. By the end of the day, American pilots had racked up 30 aerial victories for the loss of just 2 Hellcats. Japanese shock and silence reports filtered back to Japanese high command. The Zeros were failing. Veteran pilots like Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, who had survived dozens of engagements and was a legend among his peers, realized the game was changing. Sakai's own encounter with Hellcats later in the war nearly cost him his life. "These new American fighters," he wrote later, "do not fight like the others. They are faster, and they never turn." But more than speed, the Hellcats had something else: survivability. A Zero hit once often became a fireball. A Hellcat hit 4 times could still bring its pilot home. The shift in air dominance. By early 1944, the Hellcat was sweeping the skies clean. Carrier groups moving toward the Marianas and beyond were armed almost entirely with F6Fs. Their pilots, often younger and less experienced than the Japanese veterans, were now winning at ratios once thought impossible. At Truk Lagoon, during Operation Hailstone, Hellcats launched from the USS Bunker Hill scored over 55 kills in a single day. Fuel depots burned, hangars exploded, and Zero after Zero was caught trying to scramble. The myth of Japanese aerial supremacy had ended. The era of the Hellcat had begun. February 17, 1944. Truk Atoll, Caroline Islands, Operation Hailstone. The Pacific trembled under the thunder of radial engines. Lieutenant David McCampbell sat in his Hellcat's cockpit, eyes locked on the horizon as the USS Essex steamed into striking range. A salty haze clung to the early morning sky, the warm scent of oil and ocean seeping into his flight suit. Truk, Japan's so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific, lay ahead, heavily defended and crawling with enemy aircraft. McCampbell's orders were clear: sweep the skies, leave nothing standing. The deck crews gave a final thumbs up, and the first Hellcats roared into the sky. Engines screamed as wheels lifted from steel, and the blue-painted fighters arced toward the heart of enemy territory. As the F6Fs closed in, the Japanese scrambled everything they had: dozens of Zeros, Val dive bombers, and Betty bombers. Filling the air like hornets defending a nest, McCampbell's voice crackled over the radio. "Keep your energy, work in pairs, slashing attacks only, hit hard, climb out." He led by example. Diving from 18,000 feet, his section caught a flight of Zeros turning tightly below. The old dance began again, Japanese pilots trying to draw their enemy into a flat turn. But McCampbell refused. He swept through them like a scythe, guns blazing. One Zero blossomed into flame, another spiraled into the lagoon. No hesitation, no mercy. From novice to ace, the Hellcat Pilot School. The Hellcat didn't just outperform its enemies, it elevated its pilots. Naval aviators, some with barely 150 hours of flight time, climbed into F6Fs and emerged as aces. The aircraft's forgiving flight characteristics, immense power, and ruggedness allowed young men to survive and learn. Mistakes that would have been fatal in other aircraft were survivable in a Hellcat. Training shifted with the aircraft's abilities. Gone were the turn-focused dogfight drills of the Wildcat era. Now instructors hammered home the boom and zoom doctrine. Energy fighting. Gain altitude, dive fast, hit hard, climb away. A second pass only if needed. This doctrine aligned perfectly with the Hellcat's design. Its dive speed could top 400 mph. Its 650 cals gave it unmatched firepower. And its armor, especially around the engine and cockpit, meant even a direct hit might not stop the plane. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu, a former instructor turned combat ace, exemplified this new generation. Aggressive, calculated, and utterly in sync with his machine, Vraciu racked up 19 kills in Hellcats, including 6 in one mission during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. His advice to trainees? Never fight fair, get above them, stay fast, let the 50s do the talking. Engineering for victory, ruggedness redefined. No story of the Hellcat is complete without marveling at its ability to take punishment and keep flying. At Leyte Gulf, Ensign Charles Brown returned to his carrier with over 200 holes in his Hellcat after downing 2 Zeros and strafing a convoy. One wing was nearly severed, his canopy shattered, and the tail rudder in tatters. But the engine kept humming. The landing gear still deployed. He made it back. Post-flight inspections revealed the engine mount absorbed multiple 20mm hits. Any lesser aircraft would have torn apart mid-air. Ground crews began to trust the aircraft as much as the pilots did. One mechanic joked, "You can land it drunk, blind, or on fire, and she'll still taxi to the hangar." The morale shift. Japanese despair, American dominance. By mid-1944, Japanese aviators began recognizing Hellcats on sight. The long nose, the barrel body, the flash of 6 guns firing in harmony. But what unnerved them most was the sound. Veteran pilot Tetsuzo Iwamoto noted in his diary, "The new American fighter growls, it climbs forever. We strike, it does not fall." Morale among Japanese air units plummeted. They couldn't replace lost pilots quickly enough. Training programs were rushed. Aces like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa and Sadamu Komachi were increasingly isolated, fighting with green pilots against an ever-growing wave of American steel. In contrast, American Hellcat squadrons rotated out in strength, trained replacements with precision, and kept their kill ratios rising. Kill ratios and cold statistics. The numbers tell the rest. By the end of the war, the F6F Hellcat had flown over 66,000 sorties. It destroyed 5,163 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. Its kill-to-loss ratio, 19-1. No other fighter in the Pacific matched that record. The Hellcat was not the fastest, nor the most agile, nor even the sleekest, but it was the most effective. A flying anvil with the soul of a warhammer. June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea, 180 miles west of the Marianas. Dawn broke like fire over the carriers of Task Force 58. On the decks of the USS Lexington, USS Enterprise, and USS Bunker Hill, hundreds of crewmen scrambled to fuel, arm, and launch wave after wave of Hellcats. Below decks, tension crackled in every corridor. The Japanese fleet had been spotted, and it was massive. What came next would be the most decisive air battle, the Pacific War. The U.S. Navy called it Operation Forager. History would remember it as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The calm before the storm. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu adjusted his goggles and tapped the gun sight on his F6F3. He'd already made a name for himself, 19 kills. But today would push every pilot to their limit. Carrier Air Group 16 launched before first light, the growl of engines shaking bulkheads. Hellcats climbed in formation, side by side with Avengers and dauntless dive bombers. The sky was thick with contrails, and the rising sun painted the horizon blood orange. Then the radar operators aboard the USS Iowa called it Bandits. Multiple formations, bearing 015, range 120 miles. The Imperial Japanese Navy had thrown everything they had into the defense of the Marianas. Nearly 450 aircraft from 9 carriers, Zeros, Judys, Vals, and a smattering of George fighters. Many pilots were barely trained. A few had never landed on a carrier before. Opposing them, over 300 Hellcats, flown by the most combat-hardened pilots in the U.S. Navy. First contact, a one-sided slaughter. At 10:00 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared in the distance, thin black specks against the endless blue. Then came the radio call, "Tally-ho, engaging." What followed was not a battle. It was an aerial massacre. The Hellcats struck with terrifying precision. Working in disciplined pairs, they attacked from above and behind. The newer Japanese pilots, caught in tight bomber formations, couldn't evade. Their Zeros were lighter and more agile. But the Hellcats were faster, better armed, and flown by men who had survived 2 years of war. Vrachu dove from 25,000 feet, locked onto a formation of Judys, and opened fire. One burst, one kill. He rolled into the next. Another burst, another kill. By the time he pulled out of the dive, 6 Japanese bombers had fallen in less than 8 minutes. He barely spoke as he rejoined formation, his guns nearly out of ammo. Elsewhere, Ensign Wilbur, Spider Webb, and his wingman tore into a wave of Zeros attempting to cover a bombing run on USS Wasp. They shot down 3 before the enemy even knew they were there. Hellcats above, hell below, while the Hellcats dominated the skies. American battleships and cruisers lit up the sea. Radar-directed flak turned the air into a glowing death trap. Japanese bombers that slipped through the F6F screen were met with 5-inch AA shells and quad 40mm Bofors. One Judy dive bomber nearly broke through, only to be shredded mid-dive by a Hellcat intercepting it at 400 mm. By day's end, the numbers staggered the fleet. Japan lost 346 aircraft in a single day. The U.S. lost 15 Hellcats. Rear Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's first mobile fleet was left crippled. His remaining carriers limped westward, their decks empty and smoking. A Japanese radio man, captured days later, summed it up. "We never saw them, only heard the guns, and then we were falling." The nickname that stuck. After the battle, American pilots, still in disbelief at the one-sided victory, began referring to the engagement as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Even seasoned combatants like Commander David McCampbell were stunned. "It felt like they lined up for us," he said. "They came in waves, and we knocked them down like clay pigeons." McCampbell would later become the Navy's top ace, scoring 34 kills, most of them in his beloved Hellcat Mincy III. The F6F had not just proven itself, it had decimated the enemy. Strategic fallout. With the skies cleared, the U.S. invasion of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam proceeded with far fewer losses than anticipated. The Japanese Navy had bet everything on a massive carrier battle and lost nearly all its experienced air crews in one day. From this point forward, Japan would never regain air superiority in the Pacific. Carrier battles continued, but they became increasingly one-sided. American dominance, fueled by industrial might and the Hellcats' kill ratio, turned every subsequent naval clash into a mop-up operation. Even kamikaze tactics, desperate and devastating, could not dent the iron resolve of Hellcat squadrons swarming the skies over every contested island. The F6F had reshaped the war, not by speed, not by elegance, but by overwhelming force, unshakable resilience, and the quiet vengeance of a nation that had once been caught flat-footed at Pearl Harbor. October 24, 1944, off Cape Engano, Luzon Strait. Clouds rolled low over the Philippine Sea, thick with the scent of fuel and sea salt. From the decks of Task Force 38, Hellcats launched again, wings bristling, fuel tanks full, radios alive with tension. It was the beginning of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and Japan was gambling the last of its fleet in a desperate bid to halt the American advance. This was no longer a contest of matched forces. This was a rout in slow motion. Aboard the USS Essex, Commander David McCampbell led a dozen F6Fs into what would become one of the most lopsided aerial duels in naval history. At 19,000 feet, he spotted them. A formation of 40 Japanese aircraft, Zeros and Judies. Moving in ragged discipline, green pilots flew with aces. Older planes, patched and overburdened, struggled to maintain altitude. McCampbell clicked on his radio. "Hold formation, we're going in." 1 man, 9 kills. Over the next 90 minutes, McCampbell carved through the enemy formation like a surgeon. Diving, climbing, rolling, he used every ounce of the Hellcat's energy to stay alive and lethal. He scored 9 confirmed kills in a single mission. 7 Zero fighters and 2 Judy bombers, while flying alone for much of the engagement. His guns ran dry. He returned to the Essex with just 2 gallons of fuel in his tanks. It was the most successful air-to-air mission by any U.S. Navy pilot in history. The Japanese radio chatter, intercepted in TARS, translated, painted a picture of panic. "We are attacked from above. We cannot climb, cannot turn. The blue planes are everywhere." Death of the old guard. Among the few remaining Japanese ace pilots was Lieutenant Naoshi Kano of the 343rd Kokutai, a unit composed of Japan's best surviving flyers. Kano flew the Kawanishi N1K2J Shiden Kai, a powerful new interceptor. In March 1945, he engaged Hellcats over Kyushu. He was good, very good. But he was alone in a sky filled with F6Fs. Even the best-trained aces of the pre-war era were now surrounded by inexperienced cadets, barely trained in formation flying, let alone combat. Their losses mounted. The once feared names, Tetsuzo Iwamoto, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Saburo Sakai, watched as their squadrons were torn apart one by one. Some were killed in combat. Others returned to find no planes, no fuel, and no hope of resisting the Allied juggernaut. Hellcat vs. Zero. Final tally. The air war over the Pacific had transformed. When the F6F entered service in 1943, the kill ratios were still competitive. By the end of 1944, the disparity had grown monstrous. F6F Hellcat kills against all enemy aircraft. 5,163. Kills against Zeros, over 3,000. Losses in combat, only 270. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was now outdated, fragile, and hopelessly outclassed. Its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, once considered trade-offs for maneuverability, had become death sentences. American pilots, in contrast, trusted their machines to bring them home. The Hellcat wasn't just a fighter. It was a survival machine. Legacy forged in aluminum and fire. By 1945, the Hellcat had become the backbone of naval air power. It escorted bombers over Japan, strafed airfields on Iwo Jima, and tangled with the last remnants of Japanese air resistance over Okinawa. Wherever the war moved, the Hellcat led the way. And when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Japanese surrender was signed on the deck of the USS Missouri. Many of the pilots present had arrived in the Pacific aboard the wings of an F6F. For many veterans, the war's end was bittersweet. The noise stopped. The skies grew quiet. But the blue shape of the Hellcat, wide wings, thick fuselage, 650 cals glinting in the sun, was burned into their memories forever. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay, aboard the USS Missouri. The sun pierced the gray sky as Japanese officials climbed aboard the battleship Missouri, flanked by American sailors in crisp dress whites. General Douglas MacArthur stood at the signing table, firm-jawed and impassive. The formal surrender of Imperial Japan had begun. Above them, a formation of American aircraft roared across the bay in a thundering salute. B-29s, Corsairs, Avengers, and Hellcats, the same aircraft that once had to prove itself in the skies over Rabaul, now flew in peaceful formation over Tokyo. Their days of dogfighting were over, but their legacy had just begun. The end of the Zero. By war's end, the once revered A6M-0 was a shadow of its former self. Stripped of numerical and qualitative superiority, the Zero had been reduced to a tool of desperation. Many were used in kamikaze roles, flown by pilots with only the most basic training. Its final combat statistics reflected this tragic descent. Designed for agility and speed at the expense of protection. No armor plating or bulletproof glass. Flammable fuel tanks. Devastating losses in every major battle post-1943. The Zero's design philosophy, perfect for the early war, proved suicidal against more modern, armored, and heavily armed opponents like the Hellcat. And the Imperial Navy, once proud of its elite aviators, had lost over 4,000 of its best airmen in 2 years. The pilot's plane. The Hellcat had become more than a machine. It was a symbol of learning, adaptation, and vengeance. Pilots adored it, not just because it was effective, but because it kept them alive. It was a forgiving beast, as stable in a dive as it was in a climb. It absorbed punishment, responded well under stress, and never punished a pilot for pushing it. Men like Alex Vrachu, David McCampbell, Hamilton McWhorter, and Butch Voris rose to legend in the cockpit of an F6F. McCampbell, 34 kills, the Navy's top ace. Vrachu, 19 kills, and the famed 6 kills in 8 minutes. 305 Hellcat pilots became aces during the war, and many of them did it in fewer than 100 combat hours. Industrial power, tactical genius. The Hellcat was not just the product of engineering, it was the product of a nation learning from its wounds. Grumman engineers took the beatings of 1942 and turned them into blueprints. Navy tacticians shifted from outdated turn-and-fight doctrines to energy fighting, leveraging altitude, speed, and firepower. And American industry answered the call. Over 12,000 Hellcats built between 1943 and 1945. Cranked out faster than any Japanese aircraft. Delivered across the Pacific, from carriers to island bases. The sheer scale of production overwhelmed Japan's dwindling supply lines and fractured infrastructure. It wasn't just one Hellcat that made the difference. It was the hundreds that showed up each month. Post-war service and final sorties. Though World War II had ended, the Hellcat's career wasn't quite over. It flew briefly during the early stages of the Korean War in support roles and was used by the French Navy during colonial conflicts in Indochina. But as jet engines roared into the Cold War era, the Hellcat quietly faded from frontline service. Still, its reputation endured. In air museums across the United States, lovingly restored F6Fs sit with oil still in their engines, bearing the nose art and kill tallies of their youth. In air shows, Their radial engines still rumble the ground. Veterans, those who can still attend, stand beside them, touching the cold metal with reverence. For some, it was the last thing they saw before sleep. For others, it was the first thing they trusted to keep them alive. The final word. The F6F Hellcat may have started as an underestimated brute, mocked for its size, dismissed as a flying bus, and shrugged off by Japanese pilots confident in the supremacy of their Zero. But by war's end, it had become the most lethal aircraft in naval history. It did not win through elegance. It won through power, through resilience, through lessons paid in blood. It proved that victory doesn't always belong to the fastest or the flashiest, but to those who adapt, who endure, and who refuse to lose. The skies over the Pacific still echo with the roar of the double Wasp, and the ghosts of those great blue fighters still fly.